Welcome back to Rethinking Politics. Today's episode, episode 10, which we're excited about. To reach number 10 feels like a big stepping stone for some reason, even though that many of the best podcasts out there, many of the famous ones are on episode post 1000, like if you're looking at the Joe Rogan show, or in the hundreds for some of the others. But we're glad to be here still thinking, still trying to rethink politics, still trying to help people and look at politics from different perspectives and in ways that are going to be more beneficial than the standard ways that people discuss those things and spend their time on them. And as such, we're going to be looking at the Democratic National Convention. We're going to be discussing it in ways that are going to be different from what you usually hear, because in a lot of ways this is about the Democratic National Convention is about the upcoming presidential election. As such, it's inherently partisan in ways that we are not going to focus on here. We've talked about partisanship a lot in other places.
I was about to say, we've made our position on partisanship pretty clear over the past few episodes. We are not in favor of the Democrats or the Republicans coming into this election. We do not have a candidate on our hit list or a candidate on our side. So hopefully that will add a little bit of flavor and perspective that you may not get from a lot of the commentators who really do have someone in their corner. And so for us, we're just coming as a couple of cynics who are very interested in what happens to the country and also interested in this process that is so fundamental to such a large portion of how the government works.
Right. So if you're looking for a headline here of what our podcast is about, it's not the Democrats lie about all kinds of things, nor is it on the opposite spectrum of like Biden prepared to take the place of the evil Trump. Or you go look at the headlines of this thing. It's crazy. It's crazy there. They're all, every headline's clickbait about the Democratic National Convention.
No kidding.
So what we want to do is we want to inform you about the purpose of such conventions. Discuss, what is the point of having this? I don't know how many hours went into putting this thing together, but it must be crazy high. With tons
absolutely.
of people, right? Tons of people with a lot of influence that could be doing other things with their time. And we want to talk about the issues they discussed, some of the speakers, how effective we thought it was in terms of messaging and in terms of achieving the goals that such conventions are for. And then at the end, we're going to get into some critique, and we're going to critique the process and what they're reaching for and some of the ideas, but that's going to be later. And the bulk of this is meant to be something that helps you think more clearly about these conventions and see what they're about and the role they're playing in the political process. And to give you information, and for those of you who didn't watch it and don't want to watch it, this is going to be much more useful than the things you're going to get from your average hit piece or propaganda piece.
So the first thing we want to talk about is what the goals of these conventions are. Last week we had the Democratic National Convention. This week we're going to have the Republican National Convention. And clearly they're a big deal. They're both supposed to be, 4-day events, which is a long time for a political event. I mean, the DNC, between the different days was over 10 hours of content. And asking people to watch 10 hours of content is a serious commitment. So we need to understand what the goals are of a convention like this, because I think a lot of people don't fully grasp that.
Yeah, and the 10 hours of content you mentioned, it only covers the primetime stuff that's shown and presented, not even the convention processes where they get together and they establish rules and votes and procedures, and they go through this parliamentary form.
Yeah, it's none of that.
Those things, I assume, took all week.
Yeah, it's just 10 hours of speeches and videos and music. No, it's a 10-hour
presentation. Yeah,
presentation, absolutely. So the first goal of a convention, and this is probably the most important, is to put away all of the animosity that may have built up during the primaries as these different candidates competed. Because you've got Democrats are not all created equal. They are a varied group of people, just as Republicans are, and we've mentioned that before in our episodes. And those people got behind very different candidates with very different ideas. And the majority of those candidates are no longer on the ballot. Now we've just got this, one one candidate and one vice presidential candidate. And the goal of this convention is to bring all of those disparate groups back under the same umbrella, to get Bernie Sanders and all those other candidates who didn't make it to the end, to bring their followers back into the fold so that they can make a strong and unified front coming into this election in just a few weeks.
And they need that. If you get into the debates before, right, they're looking for, they're not afraid to hit below the belt when they were running before. And a lot of them have significant differences in what they want to do and what they think the problems are. I mean, in general things, they're on somewhat the same page, obviously. Otherwise, they couldn't come together at all. But some of them really do not like each other. and their fans, the people who support them, don't like each other. And they don't like each other's issues. They think that, everyone has, the closer you look at a party, the more you see the factions in the party, and you see the disparate interests, and how a lot of those interests are not just different directions or slightly different takes on the same issue. Some of them are actually opposed to each other. Sometimes you literally can't keep both people happy. And in a case of limited resources, the question of how those resources are going to be distributed is always a question of prioritizing what interests you're going to meet and those kind of things. And so this is where that comes together. This is where people with their individual ideas form a coalition.
Yep, exactly.
And part of that is forming a contrast between them and Republicans as opposed to each other. And part of that is getting each part of their base motivated. People are worn out from the war. It's been a struggle. It's been a battle, and there are some hard feelings, and there's a lot of fatigue among political insiders who've been working for so long, and now their goals need to change.
Yeah, and really, you have to fire people. You have to fire people back up again, because especially in today's political climate, where everything has been politicized, from your Facebook feed to your Twitter accounts to the news companies themselves, all the way back to to coworkers at work, friends, even family at home. Everyone's talking about politics, and everyone's being abrasive and difficult about it. And so the last thing anyone wants to do is be involved in politics. And so one of the main goals of this convention is to convince people, and more specifically to convince their base, that it's time to get motivated again, and here's why.
Part of the convention is presenting which issues they're going to be focusing on. The issues that have broad appeal and that can unite the Democratic Party. And these issues are not discussed in detail in the convention. If you're looking for the case for systemic racism, the convention is not the place to look.
No, in many ways, they're just almost reminding the base of these issues to say, here's why we need to be united. Here's why we need to take a stance against the other party. And here's why we should be remotivated to fight this fight, is these issues.
Yeah, and they're talking to the people who already agree with them.
Yeah, they're not trying to convince anyone
Yeah.
as they talk about it.
I hear so many Republicans critiquing how they're talking about these issues. But you talk very differently with someone who agrees with you on these than you would do with people you're trying to persuade. It's a different conversation.
Which is why we talked about the goals of this convention, because you may have noticed when we talked about those goals, nowhere did we mention, hey, their goal is to, convince the Republicans to join their side, or even to convince, those voting blocs in the middle who aren't sure to join the Democratic Party. That's not their goal. Their goal really is, in this convention, all about their base. It's all about solidifying that base in these different ways so that they're ready over these next couple of months to then go on and convince those in the middle and convince those who are in the more important, electoral states that this is the cause that they should be a part of. Because if your base isn't secure, then doing any of that doesn't help anyone.
And that's never more clear than it was last election, right? Where you could argue that the reason Hillary lost was her base didn't turn out.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't that Trump outperformed her per se. If you analyze the election after, this is what people will say. They'll say what happened was that Hillary was not a candidate that was able to get out everybody who should have been voting for her. And as such, this process here is the difference between, right. It's the difference between Hillary winning and Hillary losing. And you don't have to talk to Republicans to make that happen.
So real quick, we'll cover just a few of the issues they talked about. They talked about gun laws, gun restrictions, climate change, and the dangers with that. The importance of protecting our public lands, domestic abuse, and preventing violent crimes against women. They talked about making sure universal health care is a right that everyone has. They talked about child care as a right and as actual infrastructure that the economy needs. They talked about the need for universal preschool. They talked about the postal system. And they talked, the postal system was an interesting one.
It was. Some of these they framed in really odd ways. And again, if you're an outsider looking in, it's going to be odd. It's going to be odd because they're not talking to you. We got to comment on it. You say more about the postal system.
So this one I hesitate to even talk about it because it's weird. So obviously the Democrats are going to talk about the postal system as it has become a new battleground in this election is the postal system and mail-in voting. Since Trump took a stand against mail-in voting, which of course they're going to take the opposite stand. The interesting thing is that instead of focusing on disenfranchisement
Suffrage,
and making sure that everyone has a chance to vote, which they do hit on, they spend any time, which is surprising, but they spend time and they actually have a video segment not just defending the post office as something we need for this election, but talking about the post office as this noble and beautiful institution that is a hallmark of America. And, and showing video clips from people who are like, yes, my father has worked for the post office for 30 plus years. And, it's been a solid, steady job, an American job. And I'm watching this and I'm like, what is the point of this? Like, what am I watching? I don't understand. Why are we spending so much time defending the post office as an institution when that's really not the issue at all here?
Yeah, there's a clear political issue, like you said, about franchisement. It's about being able to vote. And
which is a huge issue.
Which is a big issue that everyone's like immediately like, yeah, okay, voting is an issue. Is there something affecting voting? I want to know about it. And they can pick their position on that. But no, they're like, the great and noble post office. Been with the historical value, the tradition, the nobility.
No, it convinced me. Come November, I'm going to go out. I am going to vote, and I'm going to vote for the post office. You know what I mean? Like, that's how it felt. Like
it was odd.
They were campaigning for the post office.
It was odd. And this other one was really odd too. Like those other ones, the first ones we mentioned make sense. Like childcare is a right even. Maybe you haven't heard that one yet. That people want childcare as a right. But childcare is a right. You see with COVID-19, people have to work, the kids have to stay home. Childcare is a big deal. There are the teachers teaching kids at home that are just on their iPad and their parents aren't even there. You can see why that would become something they incorporate in here, right? The post office as an institution, a noble institution, and then the last one. Oh my goodness.
The last one is it's curing cancer as an issue. And this one's funny, not because cancer is in any way funny, but because the fact that this was even made into an issue, because I don't think I've met a single person, let alone a political candidate, who has said one thing against against the need to find a cure for cancer, against the importance of finding cancer. I mean, it's a pretty universal concern, but no, they did make a point, and part of the reason they did that was because of Joe Biden's history with cancer and with his moonshot under President Obama as vice president. But it was just weird the way they presented it. Vote for Joe Biden and he will cure cancer.
Yeah, a significant portion of this presentation is a documentary style approach, where they're talking about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and to get personal history is one thing, but then they seem to integrate it in a weird way into this segment on cancer and present it as a political issue. And that's where it got weird. We're like, wait a second. We should vote for Joe Biden because of his positions on climate change, gun laws, and he's going to cure cancer. Like, wait, just in case you were wondering, about time we had a presidential candidate who's going to cure cancer. I'm ready.
So jokes aside, the three main issues that they hit over and over and over again, and the three really core issues that they kind of built their presentations around, and that almost everyone hit, was systemic racism, COVID-19, and the struggling economy. And all three of these issues are interesting because they are very specific to right now. These are not long-term issues. I mean, in many ways, the racism and the need to prop up, and support the economy are long-term issues. But in many ways, I mean, especially now, what's happening now is what they're talking about. They're talking about the things that have happened just this year as the main reason that we should vote for Joe Biden. Which was interesting, and I think part of the reason that they did that is because they're trying to build this into a movement. And that's part of why I think they push the systemic racism, is that they're trying to pull on some of the momentum that you have with civil rights and then now with this resurgence with Black Lives Matter, and turning it into a movement that everyone can get behind. Which segues into the next thing we want to talk about, which is some of the general themes and principles that they wanted to focus on in this convention. And the first one is this idea of we the people. That they wanted to focus on the fact that it's Americans that they're for, and it's everyone that they're for. That they really are a movement of the people, who are trying to take back the White House for the people, not for Democratic political leaders, not for any of these other things, but for the people themselves.
Yeah, not for big businesses or anything large scale. And we say we the people because that's the phrase they chose, and they would use it over and over again. It's the phrase in the preamble to the Constitution. We the people. And every issue they would put in the context of the average person, like just ordinary people, right? Not political insiders, as Brad said, not anybody with any power, not state governments or any other group, just normal people just in their everyday lives. And underneath that idea of we the people was a claim to virtue, I think, that they tried to use to distinguish themselves from other political groups. They're arguing that they're the people who care. They're the party who cares. They're the people
the party
who are going
cares.
In just one example of how they did this was day 2 during the nomination. So usually part of this convention is a somewhat of a formality. And the formality in this case, it depends on how the delegates are distributed in the election running up to this convention. But in this case, it was a formality, and they get the last 2 people, and they had Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and they had somebody nominate each of them in this parliamentary form and give speeches about each of these candidates before a vote from the delegates that then settled who is officially the nominee. Now, we already knew officially the nominee was Biden.
It was truly a formality in this case.
In this case, it was a formality. It's not always. If it were really close, then strange things could happen in this convention. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez makes the nomination, and gives the speech about Bernie Sanders. And then you have a nomination and a speech for Biden. And who gives this speech?
Some big political figure, I'm assuming.
Oh, absolutely. That's how it always is. Somebody who's pushed their cause and who's done those things. Now, it was a woman named Jacqueline Brittany who runs an elevator in one of the buildings that Biden is in regularly. And they talk. Now, those people, I assume this is an apartment complex or maybe even at the congressional offices. And he regularly takes the elevator that she's in running and pushing the buttons. In the kind of places that I'll never live. And
you and me both.
and they chat and they become friends. And so he asked her, or maybe she asked, I don't know how it was arranged, but she nominates him and gives a speech. And just an ordinary person. And that was part of this ongoing presentation throughout, where they would show Biden talking to ordinary people. They would, for example, with racism, they would have a bunch of black people on different screens from their own homes, ordinary people, and Biden would ask them about gun violence in their communities, and they would talk about it. For healthcare, it would show Biden sitting in a chair, again, just these screens on a wall because of COVID-19, nobody's actually there in person, and Biden would talk to them, and he would ask them how they're doing. How's their healthcare? Is their insurance covering things? And they would do this with each issue, where they would just have ordinary people, often talking to Biden about these issues. And he would ask them, and he would just sit there and listen. And the point being that they are empathetic, that they can relate to these people, and that they can encourage them. And again, this was shown through the documentary and different families that it showed, Biden's family and Kamala Harris's family, and how people feel about him, and the personal connections they make with strangers, and that they follow up on later. And those kind of things, building an image of their character specifically focused on empathy.
Mm-hmm. No, and they did hit it hard. They hit a few other ideas, like unity and the need for bipartisanship. They hit on the need for equity in America. They did bash on Trump. And then of course they hit on the significance of this election, which is something, as we've talked about before.
Oh yeah.
We love that. That everyone hits on every election. But after watching, the DNC, I am convinced that this election truly is about the heart and soul of America.
Yeah, I thought the last
any
one
election
was.
Before. I thought the last one was, but apparently it's actually this one.
Yeah.
Not the next one either. It's this specific one.
Yeah. Yeah. For now, at least. We'll see next time. When next time comes, I have this this little suspicion, right, that next time may actually be even more important somehow. But we jest, obviously. Go back to our episode on partisanship. Everybody uses this kind of rhetoric every election. Because if you said otherwise, if you said this has got to be the fourth most important election of all time, that's not helping your cause.
Mm-hmm. Or if you said, you know what? This is an election just like any other election, and we may win it and we may lose it. And either way, the government will keep on rolling. The country will keep on rolling, and we'll try again in 4 years. If they said that, there's no way they're turning out the vote that they need to win the election. And like we said before, if you go back to the purposes of this convention, it becomes clear why you would hit that issue, because their purpose is to reignite their fan base, really. And part of that is pushing the significance of this election.
Right. And so with every word they're saying, with every speech they're saying, vote.
Yeah, and that really was one of the strong themes as part of that significance is go out and vote, exercise your right to vote, make a plan to vote. And then they even had resources, which I thought was wise, on giving people ways to vote. Text this number to get more information on how to vote, and we'll help you come up with a plan. So, overall impressions from this convention, Dan.
I'm not gonna lie. Conventions are the worst. Conventions. I don't know if I can overstate my hate for political events like conventions. They leave a bad taste in my mouth. The show, let me The absolute worst part is this, that every line you have to clap, right? I cannot watch speeches without the clapping being edited. It drives me crazy. The worst is the State of the Unions, probably, right? Where you get literally one line.
One line and then
it's
clapping.
Like 10 seconds of
speaking
to, it's bad. It's bad. And they didn't have that here because it's online. There's no live audience. And that may have been the best thing that has ever happened to conventions.
To a convention, yeah.
Is to get the live audience out of there.
I agree with you completely. I agree with you that getting rid of the live audience, being able to have a more multimedia presentation, and the seamless way they integrated it changed the entire flow of this convention.
It did. They've got bands performing songs between. Now, to do that on a live stage, you either have to be just the production effects of doing that on a live stage is very difficult to switch seamlessly between speakers and groups and then videos. It just doesn't work well on a live stage. This worked really, really well.
No, and another example of that, Dan, earlier talking about when they're trying to be empathetic, they would have Joe Biden talking to 4 or 5 people on screens and just kind of having a fireside chat with them. That wouldn't work very well on a live convention. You could have those 5 people sit in chairs and Joe Biden would be like, we're glad you're here. And then the audience would go crazy and they wouldn't even be able to say anything, or they'd say one thing, like, oh man, I'm a father and I'm struggling to provide for my children. And the audience would go, oh no. And then, it just changes the whole dynamic. Instead, you can have this convention where they have a musical number, and then they segue into a speech, and then they segue into a couple of videos, and then they segue into a speech without any interaction from the audience, which you'd think would make it boring, but it actually just made it smooth. And they were able to convey more ideas more effectively because of it.
For sure. This was bar none the best convention I've seen ever, and perhaps the best political event I've seen ever. And that's not a partisan measure at all. I'm just saying that it just worked. The production was good. The fact that it was online creates some technological challenges, right? Some timing challenges and things. There were a couple moments I can think of off the top of my head where somebody was supposed to be speaking and they didn't realize the camera was rolling, right? So there's a few seconds where they figure out, oh, I'm already live, and then they speak. Or music that didn't cue quite right, camera changes that didn't happen. But they were very few. If you've seen political events since COVID-19 started, they're riddled with those things.
Yeah, virtual events have struggled in the past months. They really have.
None of the issues, none of the technological issues here were really broke the flow at all. They were minor at best, and they didn't distract from things. And so that also was helpful.
And I hope that not just the RNC this week, but also political organizers going forward take a look at this convention and learn a few things and say, even when we can have a live event, maybe there are some principles and ideas we can take from this and use again because it was fundamentally different, not because of the things they were saying, but literally because of how they were saying them. And and as someone, as someone whose frustration with politics often comes down to the fact that we talk about empty rhetoric over and over again and don't say anything. And you have these speeches that are a line of rhetoric followed by, clapping, and then another line followed by clapping, where nothing is being said. Having a political convention where candidates actually have the time to say the things they want to say was fantastic, and that's something I definitely want to see more of.
Yeah, every single speech I've watched from a president, every presidential address with the clapping in between each line, I'm just baffled that the president doesn't ask them to stop. Like, I can't fathom why that's allowed to happen and why that continues to happen.
It's just a tradition.
It is just tradition. And especially when you see the videos of the people actually doing it, often they don't want to be there for obvious reasons. Why would you want to be there standing and clapping over and over again? like my favorite's the people who are like taking the what's the word where you test to see whether someone's the purity tests, where they're like watching their own politicians to see how much they're supporting the president. Like, look at that disrespect. He's not even smiling. Like,
where they'll pan, to the family members of the president, and then these other political figures, and ooh, are they clapping? Ooh, how much do they care?
Clapping. That's a headline. Like, that kills me. That kills me. It's a waste of time. The clapping's a waste of time. The articles about the clapping are a waste of time. And the worst part is, in terms of ideas, is as you were saying, you can't develop a complicated thought in a single sentence. It takes time. If you want to talk about complicated issues and you're being interrupted every 10 seconds, it's not effective. It's not an effective use of time, and it's extremely difficult to develop complicated ideas. The kind of solutions that we need to be discussing cannot be conveyed in such a format. You can't put together a decent plan and convey it like that, and you can't analyze something and convey it like that. It's just less effective for communication, and I think that's like you said. I hope everybody takes things from this and says, "Wait, this is working. This works well. This is much clearer communication. This is a much better flow. This is going to actually convey what we want to say." And whether you agree with what they want to say or not is another issue. But
no, absolutely.
As a communication principle, this was good. This was really, really good.
No, and I think the strongest argument for that is how they were able to use this format to connect to their voting blocks, to connect to the people that make up their base. And Dan talked about this earlier, but I want to hit on it again real quick, is that they spent a lot of time in this convention having videos about regular people, videos from regular people, regular people talking, and talking, in their own homes, at their workplace, going to the hospital, to the business, to their home, to connect with them on a more personal level, which doesn't come across when you just invite that person to speak at the convention. And they were able to spend so much time focusing on these people without it getting old really fast because of that multimedia format, which worked really well.
It did. And it's different from normal convention. A normal convention, what you're going to do is you're going to invite a speaker who represents that group. You're going to say, we want to reach out to the LGBTQ voting bloc. So what we're going to do is we're going to get speakers from people that they would know who are part of that group to come and present, to come and give a speech. And that's how they incorporate it.
Mm-hmm.
This, where they actually go and they talk to people, they talk to, I mentioned black people earlier, they talk to medical professionals dealing with COVID-19 and let them speak. Let them speak in ways that most news stations never allow in terms of interviews, It wasn't an argument. It wasn't, it didn't feel forced. Like you said, if they put them on a stage, it would have.
Yeah, it felt more organic.
Mm-hmm. The uninsured and the sick, soldiers, military people who support Biden. They talked to lifelong Republicans, people who were Republicans and have voted Republican in every single election up till this one and are now going to vote for Biden. That one I thought was particularly effective. They got this group. They let them express why. They let them say why they were Republicans and talk Republican principles a little bit and then say, but here, and here's why. They're talking to immigrants about their legal status and about the issues they're facing. And they talked a lot to religious people. This one was specifically interesting, I think, because in a lot of ways, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are starting to divide more on religion.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be science versus religion with the two parties.
Right, is often how it's framed. Joe Biden is very religious. That was an important part of why he feels like he does what he does, an important part of his personal life. And so that got put in there and mentioned heavily, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah, which I thought was surprising. I was surprised that they pushed that as much as they did.
Yeah, I would have thought they would have minimized it.
So the other thing they did really well is the speeches. The speeches, there were some fantastic speeches. There were some speeches that fell flat, and then there were some speeches that were just normal convention speeches. But then there were also some speeches that were excellent.
The normal convention speeches were terrible. There were a few where people tried to act like they would in a normal convention. It was
the
rare,
audience.
And they would try and like you could feel that they were missing the clapping. and that they were looking for it. But luckily, there were very few of them, because that would have ruined it. If they would have just done a normal convention speech in this format, it would have failed. And the few that tried were definitely the flattest of the speeches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The first speech we want to talk about is Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders, his speech matters. What he says in this convention matters, because he represents an enormous group of people who may or may not vote for Biden. They're a part of the Democratic broad base, per se. Hopefully, for the Democrats. That remains to be determined, right? The Democrats are hoping with this convention of all of the groups they could incorporate through their efforts from this convention to the election, the group that Bernie Sanders represents may be the most important one. They got screwed over last election. And in the last convention with Hillary, they got thrown under the bus. And they knew it. Mm-hmm. And they were not happy about it.
Mm-hmm. And that may have played a significant role in that election, in the Democrats' overall effectiveness.
Right. It's one factor that could have been the deciding factor. Right? That if they'd done that differently, that might have changed the election by itself. So Bernie Sanders, introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as I mentioned, gets up and gives a speech. Now, Bernie Sanders is also different from the normal politicians, right? He's an idealist. He has clear principles that he thinks, and he believes them absolutely vehemently, and more power to him for that. I appreciate people who actually think what they're saying and say what they think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's better for the country, regardless of whether you think their ideas are good or bad, because it allows their ideas to be contended with and actually faced and refined and improved or rejected. Bernie gets up there and he gives what I thought was a really, really good speech. So many people never actually agree with the candidate that they endorse, right? Mm-hmm. They're challenged early on. If you are not elected, if you are not selected as the candidate, will you endorse the Democratic candidate? And the right answer to that is maybe, right? The principled answer to that is maybe. It depends on what they think. But everybody tries to demand an absolute loyalty to the party for the greater good.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Bernie Sanders seems to be the kind of person who would say, no, get lost. and so far he's endorsed all the candidates, but he explains why. And he says, look, we are making, and he specifically addresses his supporters. He says to all the people who've helped and campaigned for me and voted for me in the past, look, our ideas are becoming mainstream. Translation, we're winning the long battle.
Mm-hmm.
And he's right. They are winning the long battle in the Democratic Party. The party much more reflects them than it does the people they were arguing against over the years.
Yeah. In the past 4 years, Bernie Sanders and his ideas have taken a strong hold on the political party, to the point that a lot of people were surprised that it wasn't Bernie Sanders who was, the candidate going into this election.
Right. And it's crazy that some people who strongly dislike him don't realize they've accepted a lot of his ideas. That he's brought so much to the party. Things like equity. Equity was a word used all the time. Equity, as in equality of outcome, not just equality of opportunity, was something often repeated in this. People would talk about equality, equity, and fairness was how one person presented it. It was the 3 words they used. right? That's from Bernie Sanders and his group. So he says, we're winning the long battle. They're adopting our ideas, and Biden has specific things that we want that he's going to do. And he listed them. And they were very clear. They're not like general ideas. One of them was a $15 minimum wage. We're going to increase the minimum wage to $15. And he listed a couple others.
Yeah, like 100% clean electricity in the next 15 years, paid family leave, unions, child care was a big one, universal preschool, and affordable child care.
Yeah, these are issues specifically from his base. Compromises he has got from the broader group, because in this coalition process, right, he represents a powerful, big faction that may or may not vote for them. That gives him a real say, and he's used that to get issues that his group wants. And I dare say they're going to happen if Biden gets elected. I don't think he's up in the night. I don't think these have been false promises to him, and I don't think he's leading his group on. And that, to present it that way, I think is compelling to the people who support him. People who like Bernie Sanders, I think, will look at that speech and they will say, look, he was real with us. He recognizes that this is a compromise, but it's a compromise that leads to us winning more in the long run and leads to specific changes that are going to be better. We can get a lot of the things we want through this process. And that, I think that will sell. I think his group, anyone who looks at that speech, anyone who looks to Bernie Sanders for leadership, will vote Democrat. And that's a big deal.
Absolutely. I want to talk about two more speeches, and they're the two speeches that you would think are the most important speeches in this convention, and that's Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. Actually not. These speeches, while great speeches, were not important, and here's why. They actually set up this convention in such a way that typically with a convention, you're always building up to the candidate's speech, and the candidate's speech is the moment, is everything. It's all about their speech and what they have to say. With this convention and with the multimedia format, as Dan said earlier, in many ways, it was a documentary about Joe Biden and about Kamala Harris. And because of that, they were able to, sorry, I think I mispronounced it's Kamala Harris. Her name, for some reason, gets me every time. But
I didn't even notice that you pronounced it differently in those two times, so I'm probably saying it wrong.
There's like four ways to pronounce her name, and obviously only one of those is right. It's Kamala.
Which A you emphasize?
It's Kamala.
Kamala.
Anyways, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden. They set it up that it was a documentary, really, in many ways. They had videos with their families, talking about their family life. They had talking about their history, their past, their stories entering political office and their rise to this moment, to the point that we would have been okay without their speeches. Which I think was really clever, because it took some of that pressure away from them and distilled it throughout this whole event. And it worked really well.
It did. If you watched all 4 days, I agree with you completely that you would not have felt an absence if they did not speak more than to get up and say thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it would have worked.
It would have worked.
Now, they did do some things that were affected. Kamala, she is a very fierce person. She is strong. She's formidable. And that is kind of a counterpart to Joe Biden. Joe Biden, as you said, and especially in this election, they are pushing the empathy. They are pushing the party that cares. And so they had to reconcile that with Kamala. And they did a good job. And they did a good job, number one, in her speech. She did a very good job of connecting with her audience, of smiling. Even is such a simple thing, but of coming across,
her face off. It was,
but coming across as someone who does care, and they did that effectively. Which, once again, like I said before, does kind of fly in the face of her track record. Really,
yeah. She's a devastating prosecutor. Like she's the kind of person you don't want at the other end of you in the courtroom.
Yeah, prosecutors are not known for being empathetic.
Right,
that is not their job description.
It's not usually what we associate with them. And in the debates, she was the one who took down Biden and who put Biden in that position where for a long time, no one thought he had the slightest chance of becoming the nominee. And it was because she very tactically and brilliantly, and I guess it was an appeal to empathy the way she did it. She referred to her childhood little girl self being robbed because of the things that he did. And this but it was so brilliant. Like, it was just devastating. And Biden had no comeback. And now she's all smiles, right? She's all peace. And Biden's a great guy. And it's what this convention is for, really. It's reframing that.
And then you have Biden's speech and honestly, I don't have much to say about Biden's speech because, as I said, this whole presentation was about Biden. And so really all he had to do for this speech was not screw it up. And he didn't. He delivered a calm, reasonable, effective speech that was well written. He delivered it well, and it did not detract from everything else.
Yeah. I really liked his high rhetoric because with the way the 4 days built up to it, where he's talking about light versus darkness. Now, a lot of people have made fun of it, and perhaps rightfully so. It is usually you don't put yourself in those kind of terms. But if you watch the 4 days and you watch the clips about his religious ideas and things, it fit with the narrative really well, and it seemed
it did. So the last person we want to get to before we get to some of the takeaways and critiques from this convention, the last speech we want to talk about is Barack Obama. So Barack Obama, who actually delivered...
is old news.
So Barack Obama is old news. He is...
It's right. If you're wondering why we're talking about a former president here, because usually former presidents just more or less disappear and
no,
what they say is not that important and not directly
and
involved in
Barack
politics.
Obama was not the only former president to speak. They had the Clintons speak, the Carters speak, and that did have weight, but it had weight in a sense of, okay, yes, the previous Democratic presidents support him, he's following in this line of Democratic presidents. And that's kind of what you'd expect from Barack Obama is, I know Joe Biden, he worked for me and he was good. And in that speech, Barack Obama did say that. But the other things he said is what was so interesting. This speech was actually the best speech of the convention, hands down.
Bar none.
And if you didn't listen to any of the convention and you're like, oh, maybe I should listen to some, just listen to Barack Obama's speech.
Right, in terms of the quality of the content, like if you want to say what matters and what's going to change people's minds and things, I think the Bernie Sanders speech may have more of a direct political impact. But in terms of just like the quality of the content and the ideas and the clarity, Obama's speech was truly something else.
Yeah, it was. It was. I mean, there were passages where he paints a picture and he builds an argument, as we said, that couldn't be built in a normal convention format or in a normal, State of the Union format. And I've listened to Obama's speeches before, especially the big ones as he was running for office the 2 times and, his State of the Unions, his inaugural addresses. And and you can see where a lot of his rhetoric, his way of speaking is all there. But there was something more in this speech that I didn't feel before and I didn't hear before that really came through in this speech. And it was fantastic. It was an amazing speech. And I resonated with a lot of the things that he said. Even though obviously I don't agree, I don't agree with Barack Obama. I don't agree with Joe Biden. I don't agree with most of the candidates who are running, right? But even still, I resonated with what he was saying.
That speech ended with me. I think I could sit down and have a political conversation with Barack Obama. And I never felt that way about him before, right? Like I feel like it was, so many times presidents it's just talking points, just empty rhetoric and things. But no, he had things that he clearly believed, and he argued in some cases even passionately for them.
And that's something that we're always happy to see. is people who believe things and stand up for
think
them.
things and say those things. It's amazing.
Because that's something that you don't see that often
in politics.
In politics. Which brings us to the takeaways. And the first takeaway is we want to give each of you a shot of cynicism, because rhetoric aside and their overall skills and production quality from this convention, and then we'll see from the next convention, all of that aside, we need to remember what this is all about. And what this is all about is who is going to be in charge of, arguably the most powerful country in the world. And there's a very strong argument for that.
Military is pretty compelling, yeah.
And who gets to control trillions of dollars, and who gets to control the most powerful military, who has the power to veto Congress, who is in charge of the executive branch, which has incredible power and controls a large amount of money in and of itself. That's what we're talking about. You know what I mean? We're not just talking about the people, and we're not talking about ideas. We're talking about real power, and we're talking about the power. You know what I mean? People always say being the leader of the free world, that's the president of the United States. And so that's what we're talking about. That's what the Democrats want, and that's what they're fighting for here. And so it makes sense that they would put together such an effective convention, because why wouldn't you go all in if this is what you're fighting for?
Right. This 10-hour presentation that we've been praising is highly effective. Whatever investment required to make this good is a drop in the bucket when you're talking about this level of power and money and things. This is, you can say that politics is about more than the money and power. And I hope for the people involved it is. I hope for Biden and company that it is. But it's also at least about
those
money
things
and power. It can't be more, it can't be less than that.
Yeah.
And so those things must always incur a bit of cynicism. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. You would be naive to think that doesn't matter and that doesn't play a role.
And it's something that politicians almost never talk about. You know what I mean? Because obviously that doesn't sound good.
Right. If they're aware of it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's like, as Dan's saying, even if they believe in more than that, they also want those things, but they can never come out and say that, because they'll be tarred and feathered, because we have this idea of where we have to pretend, we have to only talk about the high rhetoric. We can never talk about the nitty-gritty, about what we're actually looking at, about what this actually means, not just for us, but for them.
Which brings us to the second thought we want to add to this discussion. Bipartisanship, they talk a lot in there about, like, we got to unite, we got to cross aisles, we got to do all this stuff. We the people, we represent you. You can say, I feel like to say it just straight up is just too cliche, right? People can say what they want. People can say things and not mean them. And that doesn't need to be stated. But most people don't realize what goes into this process in politics at the highest level. You'll get people who, and we may have talked about this a little bit in our partisanship episode, but if I'm running for president, I need to know before I say something whether or not it's going to be effective. And so what they do is they'll spend millions of dollars bringing in the groups they want, people from the groups they want to talk to. They want to talk to blacks about racism. What they're going to do is they're going to bring in a random sample of black people. They're going to pay them for their time, of course, and run a little study, run a little focus group, where they then say things to them and see what effect it has, see what works and see what doesn't. And they test phrases.
Yeah, and you don't see that when you see Joe Biden get up and say, you know what? I'm just a man. I'm just part of the people. And I know that, I know that 9/11 was bad and America was good, and I'm not saying just Joe Biden. I'm just saying politicians in general, that's kind of the vibe.
Right.
But he didn't just come up with that as he was sitting at home trying to think of what to write. That's not the process, as Dan's explaining. No, it's not even just a speechwriter who is told by Joe Biden, here's what I want to talk about, and then he comes up with a speech, or she comes up with a speech. No, you got to go much farther back,
layers and layers.
And you have to look at people who are like, here are the words and phrases that are effective. People are sick of partisanship. So we're going to talk about unity. We're going to talk about the people and about bringing people together. And we're going to say catchphrases that resonate with people along those lines.
And we know these catchphrases because we had 20 that would work, but this one is the most effective of the 20.
But these 5 are the ones that really hit these 7 different key groups that we looked at. So me and Dan sat through a couple of cynics and watched the entire Democratic National Convention, which I've never done before. I've never watched either convention all the way through. I would just, get bits and pieces, usually just the big speeches. And so it was interesting watching the entire thing because I could see the overall structure, the overall planning, and we're talking about how well it was done because in this case, as well as the other cases, in terms of focus testing, in terms of catchphrases, in terms of buzzwords, they put in the work. Those focus testings and studies paid off because you can see where from start to finish, if you watch this entire thing, regardless of where you were at the beginning, you are going to feel more favorably about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. It's just going to happen that, I have my political opinions and I have very strong opinions about principles and policies and what the president should be doing. All of that aside, there's more warmth in my heart towards Joe Biden now than there was before. Is that going to change the way I'm going to vote this November? No, but I'm also, like I said, very different and very stubborn and cynical. So take that aside, you can see how effective this is and how effective that is, but you have to remember that just because they're using these words doesn't really affect their policies at all in almost any way.
No, and as we pointed out, they're not making the case for issues here. They're discussing, what they're doing is they're presenting a feeling and an emotion and a virtue and a culture. And, it's an empathy-driven culture about caring about people and acting for the little guy and reaching out to people and strengthen each other in hard times. And you get this cultural vibe, right? This cultural message. And I agree with you, Brad, that it's persuasive in its sphere. And you have to recognize that sphere does not extend to issues. And those issues, if this persuades you, then you probably didn't have a strong opinion on the issues going in.
Or in the process, you've forgotten about those issues, which is pretty easy to do when you're looking at something that's so carefully crafted like this is. I'd say one follow-up talking about this, about words and ideas. We talked last week about inflation and some of the relief aid. And in many ways, the relief aid is like one of these conventions, where it's all good and no bad. And if this is all you look at, of course you're going to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris. Why would you not? And that's how they did their job correctly. You know what I mean? They have painted a picture, and just by watching the picture, it's hard not to be convinced. And it's just like the inflation, where it's like, you are going to be better off. We're going to be better off. Everyone's going to be better off. And it's a very common line that parties will tell, but just because they say it doesn't mean it's so. Just because, we seem better off doesn't mean we are, like we talked about with the inflation. And we need to remember that. We need to see past the illusion and see the reality underneath. We are going to be covering this election as much as we can possibly stomach as we go throughout the rest of this year.
Which, to be fair, thanks to COVID-19, maybe more than we thought, because the presentations are getting better.
are getting better. And hopefully we'll see more of that throughout this election, and we can keep down more of what we're eating. And so we're going to have more specials. Like I said, next week we are going to cover, the Republican convention, and we will try and get that out to you guys as quickly as possible. And we're going to cover some of the debates and some of the speeches to try and provide a slightly different voice on this issue, because there is so much mud and there is so much obfuscation. And I use that word because most people don't know that word, and that's the point. Obfuscation means to confuse, to muddy up an idea or something that you're saying, and that's exactly what's happening here. And that's why I like the word, is because it defines itself. And that's what's happening. That's what this election is. It really is smoke and mirrors on both sides. And we want to look at those mirrors and look at that smoke and look at what's going on so that we can all see just a little bit more clearly.
One of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to be following up with the things that are said. So often, politics is disconnected from the rhetoric and the actions that actually happen. You can go and you can look at records. There are bills, there are records, there are votes, there are policies that are implemented, there are things that are done that are done in the name of these rhetorical points that these people have made. And if you follow up with those, you may find a very different vision of the people than what's being presented. And if you don't follow up with those, you'll never really know these people.
Mm-hmm.
You're never going to. The surest way to tell what someone is like is to see what they do, not what they say. And everybody knows that. But it seems worth noting again here because it happens so rarely in politics. In part because of the partisanship. They just blame the other party. If it goes well, it's because I did it. If it goes poorly, it's because the other party got in the way, right? They've got an easy out for everything that goes wrong, and they're never held accountable. And they should be, and they can be.
And in many ways, politics then does come down to this is what I say versus this is what you say. And let's see who is saying the better thing. And that's the person who will win. And I mean, that's the thing looking at this convention is that they said things incredibly well in terms of politics, in terms of an election. That's how you win. You know what I mean? And they have come out swinging strong. But in terms of what they're doing and what that actually means, it doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything, and we will look further into that to say so. With that, thank you very much for listening. We have endured the 10 hours on your behalf.
I believe it'll be 4 days of convention again. So we'll see whether or not they follow or if they have 10-second sound bites and then clapping. But either way, we're gonna listen to it all. We're going to talk about it, and I'm sure there will be some interesting takeaways because there always are. Whether good or bad, there's always something to be learned and always something to be talked about. So please join us next week, and we will see you then.
Till next time.